How is it going, guys? And welcome back to a new episode here with some Pod Limit Omaha content on my YouTube channel. Jumping immediately into the action. Today we are reviewing two tables of PLO 100 action on GG Poker. Guys, if you like the content, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't already. And also, of course, check out PLOmastermind.com if you want to learn more about Pod Limit Omaha, not only from myself, but also from other PLO professionals. Check that out. You now can also get access to PLO Trainer completely for free, but I will share more about that later in this episode. Let's jump into the action. Table number 2. I think I defend in the big blind against a under the gun open and a button call. Pretty standard with my hand. Flop goes check, check by all three players. Now on the turn, I could consider leading because this is definitely a card where my range will have some strong mate hands. But I think my hand definitely is better off by just checking. Taking it that way basically, and against a large bet, I do have to let it go. Table number 1, beautiful flop after open raising. Flopping top 2 pair and the nut flush draw. Amazingly strong hand. Almost a hand to consider slow playing and checking back. But usually whenever you're in position and you have a strong hand, you want to build a pot because there's no one left behind you anymore to do the betting for you, right? So you have to do the betting yourself. Unfortunately, my opponent makes the fold and we take down the pot. Today we're playing PLO 100. Recently I've been playing a lot of PLO 50 on the streams here. As you guys know, things have been going pretty well there overall. And now it is time to check out the PLO 100 pools. See if the games are any different. If we see different tendencies, different opponent styles, etc. So let's get into it. Table number 1, against the pot size bet, it's a little bit tricky. We do have top pair and 2 backdoor flush draws and the blockers to the straight draws with deuce deuce. I could consider raising, I could call. Folding is not, I don't know, like folding doesn't seem to be great, to be honest, with my holding. So probably between raising and calling, both are okay. Maybe I like raising even a bit better, but because he uses such a large sizing, I opted for a call. Turn goes check, check after I do call, and on the river I have a pretty straightforward check fold, I think. Not a hand to do anything there, given the line taken. So yeah, let's see what happens today. PLO 100. I imagine that we're definitely gonna see a regular on average that is a bit stronger, more skilled. You will also see some regulars that play PLO 200, for example, usually, but they sometimes drop down to PLO 100 if there's no game running. Like I can see that happening. Table number 2. Flopping bottom pair and a gutter. We do have a diamond. I think this is a pretty reasonable candidate to lead out because my hand is not strong enough to check call. Definitely it's strong enough to check raise. So leading out with everything going on, I think is reasonable. Turn is the 7. Pretty good turn, but getting value or betting again becomes a little bit tricky and thin. So I could check and use my hand as a bluff catcher. Turn goes check, check, and on the river I decide to check call. Blocking boats, blocking the straight as well. I think that's definitely reasonable. And unfortunately my opponent did end up having the straight. And we lose the pot. Table number 1, I raise it up with my blockers against a min bet on the flop. And we do take down the pot. An ace 10, 8, 6 suited to the ace. Definitely a playable hand, I would say. But it depends what happens. Like against a raise and a 3 bet, I do have a pretty straightforward fold, I would say. An ace king 9, 9 on table number 1 will also be just a fold. Let me know, guys, what you have been up to recently. Are you playing a lot at the moment? And if so, what stakes, what games are you playing? Are you also playing on GG? Or are you playing on different sites? And of course, if you have any questions about the hands, please let me know and I will do my best to answer them. Ace 8 6 4 suited to the ace. Triple suited will be a fold from early position. Table number 2. Definitely a hand to open raise with, but it's not a great hand when you think about the fact that if we face a 3-bet, for example, we probably have to let our hand go. And against a squeeze, especially in the sandwich position, like what I mean by that is I am in between the squeezer and someone behind me. I do have to let my hand go because it will be very difficult post-flop to realize the equity of my hand. Table number 2, we open raise. And on table number 1, flop goes check, check. And on the turn against a half pot size delay, I now remember that I went for an exploitative check raise on the turn, given that my opponent's sizing is a little bit weakish to me. Like, I do see most people betting larger if they have a strong hand at this point. But also a lot of his good hands are removed from his range because he didn't bet the flop himself. So definitely not a standard play there, I would say. It did work out, luckily. And I think it will work out very often against a lot of opponents. I think the delay check raise line is super powerful because a lot of players, they will not protect their checking range well enough. And you can exploit that by taking aggression whenever they bet in that node of the game, basically. But keep in mind that it does depend sometimes on sizing or timing tells or your opponents. So definitely something to be aware of. And also these check raises, they are definitely not a thing in theory. So you won't compare something like that with like an optimal environment. You have to do that really based on how your opponent is playing or how you believe your opponent is playing. Because by the end of the day, we'll never know, right? We just can make assumptions based on what we think is happening, how he plays, how he approaches the game. But it will never be accurate to a certain degree, right? We only can know so much. Table number 2, easy c-bet, top and bottom pair and the nut flush draw. Under the gun against the big blind, and my opponent lets it go and we take it down. Ace King 7-3. I think this is pretty close. We do have a short stack player on the button, therefore I think folding is better. If not, we definitely have a reasonable candidate to come in for a raise, because we have the ace and the king blocking continuing ranges quite heavily there. And also what you will see in these pools is that usually players play a bit too tight, I would say. Now, I did play a couple more sessions after I recorded this one on PLO 100, and I realized that there's actually quite a big difference, or I mean quite a big, like I didn't play it as much yet recently, but what I want to say is that my impression at the moment is that on PLO 100, players are a little bit less tight overall than at PLO 50 in the fast forward pool, where the average VPIP was very low, very tight. You can get away with a lot of stealing. And I think at PLO 100, this is a little bit less of a thing. It's still a thing, but something to be aware of. And I will definitely pay attention to it once I play more hands in this pool, basically. Table number 1, Queen 5-3, 3-bet pot. I decide to pot. Potting is my preferred sizing on Queen 5-3, rainbow, from the cutoff against an early position player. Let's take a brief look into PLO Trainer and take a look if this actually makes sense. Also the bet with my hand ace, ace 6 deuce. I'm gonna take a look if I have this board. If I go to the cutoff versus early position, and we're loading up this situation and I'm searching for Queen 5-3, I can see that for this exact situation, I don't have Queen 5-3, but I have a board like Queen 4-3 or Queen 5 deuce, and I think both boards would be reasonable. So I'm going to go with Queen 5 deuce. Now on this board, the out of position player doesn't really have a leading range because the 5 and the deuce are so irrelevant for his range. So he's checking full range, and in position is using a full pot bet sizing only, and we can bet almost 70% of the time, right? You can see that on the top right. So we're doing a lot of betting, and whenever you know that we're doing a lot of betting, like an overpair with a straight draw probably is strong enough to bet. So if I would filter for something like ace a 6-3, which is a pretty similar hand than I had in game, like ace a 6-3 is betting 69%. There is a little bit of checking back actually with the very best ones with 2 backdoor flush draws. But usually you can get away by just betting. Also, if I change to a hand like ace 6-4, for example, we're also betting. So betting in this situation definitely makes a lot of sense, I would say. Turn is the queen. I think on this card, it's a little bit more tricky to bet because what are we going to get value from? Yes, there is the diamonds out there that we can get value against. But I think there's definitely something to be said for checking back, which is what I do here. So I do check back. My opponent on the river leads out for full pot. We make a straight on the river. So we definitely have a call, even though we don't block any of the boats. Especially also when you consider that our opponent didn't check raise the flop against our large bet. A lot of his 2 pairs and sets basically will therefore be removed from his range. So he's not going to end up on the river with a lot of boats, right? So it's a little bit like thinking like how to read this hand, right? How to read his range. So if you pot on the flop, like my assumption is that the majority of the players against a pot size bet, they will check raise queen, queen, 5-5, and 3-3 with a very high frequency. Sometimes they will not check raise queen, queen, but I think against a pot size bet, because they believe that they will not have fold equity. I'm not going to fold if I bet full pot. That's their perception. That they're just going to get it in. So it sets. And also I think the majority of 2 pairs are going to be pushed into the middle on the flop. Like queen 5, queen 3, even 5-3. Like it just makes a lot of sense to get it in. So therefore, yes, he will have some queen X on the river, which would then river into queen 4, which is possible. But it's just not that likely he's going to have like a boat on the river. On top of that, he could have a straight like 6-7, which you could definitely play the same way. So that's like probably the most tricky hand to turn into or to river into basically. Luckily, he didn't have 6-7 and we would take it down. But I think that's the way you want to approach the spot, right? Think about like how likely is it your opponent has like a certain hand? And how does that impact his river betting range? Like how likely is it that he has a strong hand on the river at this point? Anyway, on the flop, on table number 1, I'm going to check call. Like king 6-5 suited to the king pre-flop. It's a little bit loose in this rake environment, I would say. Like I think calling is okay, but it's not going to print a lot of money. I think flop check call is standard on Jack 3. Now, on the turn, it becomes a little bit tricky because he's using a small sizing, right? And he's double barreling. So we should ask ourselves, like, what hands is he double barreling for with this sizing? Like, he open raises from under the gun. And he's going to have plenty of aces there, right? So aces bet flop and then bet small on the turn. I think that makes a lot of sense. Jack X could also make a lot of sense, but he doesn't have a lot of Jack X, but it's part of that range. Now, any other value, basically, it becomes like very thin. Like imagine he's sitting there with queen, queen, or he's sitting there with 10-10, but even king, king. I mean, we have 2 kings in our hand, so let's ignore king, king for a little bit. But queen, queen, and 10-10, like value that we are beating, like it's very unlikely that he's going to bet the turn with those hands. It's possible, but it's not that likely because we are also perceived as a range that can have king, king fairly often. So it doesn't make too much sense to go for thin value there. On top of that, like if he's bluffing, like how likely is it that he's going to bluff with this sizing? It's possible, but I would say the majority of players, if they are bluffing, let's say he's bluffing with a hand like ace, queen, or king, queen, 10, like I think a lot of players would double barrel as a bluff for like half pot, maybe a little bit bigger, because he wants to push pairs out of the pot like 10-10, 9-9, queen-queen, make them into a difficult decision. And this sizing is not really doing that efficient, I would say. So It's a little bit tricky, and based on what happened so far, I do put him more on value than on a bluff, basically. Now, it's interesting because on the river, when I check again, my opponent now has a decision. Like, he can value bet for... I mean, he can value bet Jack X, of course, and Ace Ace, which are both pretty clear value bets. Is there other value that makes sense to bet with? Well, King King maybe, but we're blocking King King. And Queen Queen and 10-10 becomes like very thin, right? We, I think, agree on that. Now, when we think about his bluffs, I think on the river, like, it makes a lot of sense for him to find a reasonable amount of bluffs. Because he knows that his range has plenty of value with Ace Ace, Jack X, King King. So he can find bluffs. And any unpaired hand basically at this point is a pretty clear bluff, or can bluff at least, to put pressure on my pairs. The thing though is that on the turn, his sizing was so much leaning, in my opinion at least, to value, that I give his river bet more credit, therefore, more value heavy. And that makes like calling down a little bit more difficult in my opinion and questionable. And therefore I think I ended up folding in hindsight, which I think is reasonable at this point. But I might have made a different decision if his turn sizing would have been different. Anyway, something to consider, like a little bit of a more broader explanation about that hand, about some of the hands today. But I think that's definitely reasonable. Table number 1, what happens here? I fold Queen Jack 10 deuce. Queen Jack 10 deuce triple suited. We're playing 130 big blinds. Let's take a look, guys, into PLO Trainer to see if this actually is correct. So I'm opening up PLO Trainer. We're going to the 150 big blind solution first. Queen Jack 10 deuce. We are looking at triple suited hands. Like, this is just going to be a call, so my fold is incorrect. It's not going to be a very profitable call, like we're only winning a little bit of money back. If I go to the 100 big blind solution and open this one up, let's see what happens here. The profitability of the call is pretty similar, but again, we do see that this hand is a call. So folding my specific hand pre-flop is definitely a mistake. This should have been a call. Now, if we go back to this situation and think about, okay, do we ever fold like 3 Broadway cards? Like, let's say I type in Queen Jack 10. We do see that Queen Jack 10 is pretty much always a defend, except for like some of the weaker rainbow ones, which I think intuitively make a lot of sense to fold. Let's say we have a hand like King Queen Jack. We see somewhat of a similar pattern. So 3 Broadway cards is a very high frequency defend. Okay, so that's good to know, guys. One thing that I want to add here is that you can now get access completely for free to this pre-flop solution that you see in front of you now. Like, this is the small stakes of 100 big blind solution for GG Poker. PLO 50, PLO 100, PLO 200 stakes. And if you play those game or a game that is similar to that, there's a lot of value now in opening up PLO Trainer, getting access to this completely for free, and start doing study work, but also training work. You can jump into a training session very quickly and easily and start working on your pre-flop game. Completely for free. You can click on the link below, open up a free account at plomastermind.com if you don't have that yet. But if you do have a free account already, then you can just go to PLO Trainer. I'll put down a link below to that as well. Log in and have access immediately to this pre-flop solution. So make sure to check it out. The small stake solution for a 100 big blind is now freely available, guys, to all of you. Okay, let's keep going. As we know, I am folding on table number 1. And I will come in for a somewhat exploitative 3-bet on table number 2, Ace Queen 10-9. Ace Queen 10-9, 100 big blinds cut off against middle positions. Actually something that we can look into briefly. So single suited rundowns with an ace, we're usually not 3-betting that often, that hand class, because we prefer to have like high equity hands when we're building a pot. High pairs, double suited hands basically. But there is like a hand class, which is the unpaired single suited hand class that does have an ace, where there is a little bit of 3-betting, but not a lot. Now, if we look into the off-suited ace hands and we're looking at the connected Broadway hand class, like this is the exact hand class where my hand falls into. And what we see is that on the right side, these are the 3-bets. Hands like ace, king, jack, 10. Ace, king, queen, jack. A hand like ace, queen, jack, 10. Ace, queen, 10, 9. Ace, queen, 10, 9. This is actually the hand that I was holding. However, a subtle but important difference here is that we're here looking at the queen high suit as a 3-bet. And I think I have the 10 high suit. So only one bad suit, basically. And this variation on the left side is going to be a fold. So my 3-bet is actually a little bit too loose, My opponent also doesn't seem to be super loose. Like his VPIP is only 23. So it's not that he seems to be going completely out of line. So I think therefore my hand becomes more questionable even. Anyway, we do end up in this 3-way situation. On the flop, I think I have a very easy check back. I have a gutter. I don't block any of the pairs. And I'm in position. So let's take a free card. And the free card is actually amazing. We turn a straight. Now I decide to call. I think against a pot size bet, usually you just want to call because your opponent is wrapping the same hand or he's wrapping a bluff. And against that range, pretty much, you want to keep in his bluffs usually if you're in position. However, what I do believe is that there are plenty of recreational players that will bet the turn too light, or at least they pot the turn too frequently with maybe a set or maybe a non-nut straight. And they will not necessarily fold those hands against the jam. So I might miss out on value if I call. I'm not 100% sure if that is the way this situation plays out against this player. Let me know, guys, below in the comment section what you think is better, shoving or calling. I ended up calling, again, keeping in his bluffs if he is bluffing. And the river is the jack of diamonds. My opponent ends up checking. And of course, we have a very straightforward bet. SPR is a little bit over 1. I think we can go different ways. We can bet big pot. We can actually also go very small. I think actually like this sizing, I'm not sure how much I like this specific sizing. I either want to bet small, I think, wrapping the nuts. Or I want to bet small, like maybe 20% of the pot or 30% of the pot. That way, A, try to get called as light as possible by like a 2-pair hand or a set. But B, also give my opponent room to maybe do something crazy, check raise bluff, which he's never going to do against this sizing. So I don't like my river sizing here in hindsight. My opponent folds, and we do take down the pot. Let's see, ace, 10, deuce, deuce. I would say this is a playable hand. It is a playable hand, although we are up against under the gun. However, this player is pretty loose, 44 VPIP, so I think it's okay-ish. And on the left side, we're looking down at ace, king, king, 4. We're 200 big blinds deep. This is pretty interesting. Is this potentially on the left side a hand to call to 4-bet with? Like, that's the question. I personally think it's not. I'd rather use different hands to 4-bet with. But let's take a look. Let's take a look, guys. Use PLO trainer, 200 big blinds. Cutoff open, button 3-bet. Action is back to us. Let's open up the categories. Focus on the 1-pair single-suited hands, 25% 4-bet. Ace is always a 4-bet. Broadway pairs with the ace. Ace high suited here, 19% 4-betting. Let's take a look. We actually see that ace, king, king is a pretty high frequency 4-bet. Actually, ace, king, king, 4. This hand is a 4-bet. Let's look at the EV difference. EV difference is very minimal. In other words, the value, it's by the way, this small green number that you see, 0.08. It basically means that the value of 4-betting is only 0.08 big blind per hand better than the value of calling. So very, very minimal. So calling is not necessarily a huge mistake. So that's good to know. But it's interesting to see that we do actually 4-bet ace, king, king quite a bit. Like all these hands. I mean, ace, king, king, 10, ace, king, king, jack, I think makes a lot more sense. But with the 4, I would have thought it was actually going to be a call. So the play is to 4-bet, and then if my opponent would 5-bet, let's take a look into this specific, it is important to make sure that you then fold against the 5-bet. So ace, king, king, my opponent comes over the top. We are folding all these variations. So keep that in mind. I think I'm going to make the call, which we now know, at least in an optimal environment, is a mistake. And on 7-6-4, pretty straightforward check, I would say. Like, it doesn't make too much sense to start turning our hand into bluff immediately. We have showdown value, we have a 4, we have backdoor spades. Let's hope our opponent checks back. My opponent does check back, but on the turn is a bit tricky. The turn is a bit tricky. He bets pretty large. Like, first of all, how likely is it my opponent did improve to a better hand from flop to turn on the jack? Well, he's not necessarily going to improve to a lot of 2 pairs, I would say. Although there's definitely some in there. Hands like jack 10, 8, 7. Jack 10, 9, 6. Like those types of hands that he would 3-bet with pre-flop. Sometimes check back that now improve. He can bet them for sure. You can also have like some hands like ace, king, jack 6. Ace, king, jack 7. Those hands also become value. You can have some jack, jack. You can have some slow play 2 pairs or sets or straights on the flop. So actually, I think he has plenty of value now that I think more about it. Plus, he can have a hand like ace, ace, jack as well, where he's now blocking the jack. So I think actually he has plenty of value that's beating me. So I think on the turn, I just have a very straightforward check fold. Not strong enough to continue. Let's see what I did. I do end up folding. Now let's quickly go back to table number 2, where I defended pre-flop, and now on the flop I take a stab, which I think is completely fine, especially against the average player that is over folding against the bet, under check raising, like just stabbing. Pretty good. Like this board also, I will have a lot of 2 pair sets in my range, so I need to find enough bluffs. And on the turn king, things are a little bit interesting. My opponent checks, and the question is, do we want to fire and turn my hand again into a bluff, keep barreling, or give up? And my idea of this spot is that the turn bet is very credible at this point, especially because I believe that a lot of my opponents are either betting the flop themselves or check raising the flop too often with a king, especially with their good king X hands. So he's not gonna have a lot of king X in his range. Now also sometimes people will lead out on the king if they have a king now at this point, so they have trips, so they will lead out. So in that sense, like, I don't see a lot of king X. Also there are 2 on the board anyway, making it less likely he has a king himself. And I have still the uncapped range. Like, I bet the flop. So I have all the king, jack, 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 king X in my range. And therefore, I need to find bluffs. I have a hand with basically no showdown value. But on top of that, I do have some deceptive outs, right? Like, I have a queen, potentially, that can be good if I get called. I have the deuces even that can potentially backdoor into a boat. So I also block ace-ace, which is good. So I actually think this is a pretty good hand to keep firing with on the turn. So let's see. I think I do bet the turn. I don't think I even have to go this large. And I do take down the pot. So that's good. Ace, queen, 8-6. I would open raise this on the button, which is what's happening. Let's see. Romario, the legendary football player back in the days. And I flop an open-ender and a queen. Oh yeah, I remember this hand. I'm checking back in-game, which I don't like. I think betting is better. Now, the reason why I think betting is better is because my hand, even though I have an open-ended straight draw where I want to realize the equity of the open-ended straight draw, the problem with this open-ended straight draw is that it's so weak that on a lot of the turns, if my opponent bets, I will have to fold. Imagine the turn is a blank, for example, and my opponent would bet 2/3 pot. Like, it's a pretty light. It becomes like pretty tricky to continue there because I have such a marginal hand at this point. At the same time, I have a club. I block at the 8, or I have the 8 blocking 10-8. I have the queen also wrapping around the 3 cards on the board. So I actually think betting here is reasonable, and we have a very easy bet fold if we get check raised. Table number 2, we get a walk. And on table number 1, yeah, you can see now that against a pot size bet, like, how can I continue really? Like, I don't think I can. I just have to let it go. King, Queen, Jack, 4 double. Table number 2. Pretty easy open, I would say. This is also a hand that can continue against the 3-bet. Ace 6, 5, 3, table number 1. This is pretty light, I would say. This is pretty light. The problem is that we have a gap at the bottom. Table number 1, I decide to 3-bet pocket aces. And we get a call. This player seems to be playing pretty wide. King 8 deuce, dry board. Betting half pot with a lot of hands in my range. I think that's a good start and a good default. On the turn, it's a little bit close between bet and check. Like, I check fairly quickly. Now, the problem is that if I bet and get raised, it's very problematic. Like, because I'm in such a difficult spot. Now, the thing is that by my opponent not raising the flop, he does remove a lot of his 2 pairs and sets from his range. And yes, on the 7, he sometimes turns into 8-7 or King 7. But those hands will not necessarily raise the turn. At the same time, there are still King X hands out there I can get value against. There are straight draws. There are flush draws that I dominate. So I actually think that betting on the turn is pretty reasonable, given the likelihood that I'm not going to get raised very often, I think, on the turn. River, King. I think check is now the play just because, like, what am I really trying to get value from if I bet? Yes, I can get called by, I mean, an 8. 8 is pretty thin, I think. My opponent's unlikely to have like hand like queen, queen, ace 3, queen, queen, jack 10. Like, is he really continuing those hands on the flop against a bet? Probably not. So I think checking is the play and then hoping to induce against the bluff, like a missed or turning an 8 into a bluff, something like that. So I check. My opponent bets pretty quickly, $20. I snap call. And we run into King 10, 5, 5. So you see, like, this is the type of hand that I'm missing value against now by checking the turn. Yeah, I don't like how I played the hand, I think. Table number 2, in the meantime. Flop, check, check. Turn, I bet pot. And I get check raised to full pot. Pretty deep. I think the reason I like a raise here more than a call is because I do have additional backup in the form of like a redraw to a higher straight. Also, the board is very, very draw heavy, so it's not that likely that my opponent is just check raising random bluffs, I would say, on the turn. So it's likely that he has either a straight or a made hand in the form of a set or a flush draw with a made hand, same as that he has now, that he wants to stack off with. So I much rather try to get as much money in as possible against those hands that I'm ahead of. And we do take down a nice pot. He did have a set and a nut flush draw. Pretty big hand, pretty big hand. Now, one thing, if we go back quickly, like this player decides to check raise on the turn. So let's actually go to the turn to make it easier. So I pot the turn. And by potting the turn myself, I basically say I have queen jack, I have jack jack, I have queen queen, or I have like, I mean, some flush draws with like the turn 2 pair now, something like that. But I have a very narrow and well-defined range because I'm potting. Because I'm potting, I'm saying I have a strong hand or a strong bluff. And there are not that many strong hands on the turn, other than a straight, that I didn't bet the flop with. So therefore, I'm repping the straight, or I'm repping a bluff most of the time. And I don't think that you want to check raise a set, even though you have a nut flush draw with it, against that range. So I think in his shoes, what I would do, I would just call. I would just call, even though I have a pretty good hand, right? Well, like with ace, 9-9, and a nut flush draw. There's one other thing that makes building a big pot not as great, and that is that he also has an 8. And the 8 basically is blocking an out for himself to improve. So if he's up against the straight, he wants to have as many outs as possible to improve to a flush or a boat. And in this situation, he's already blocking one of the boats himself. Anyway, good for me. Money goes in. Luckily, we hold. And we take down a nice pot. Table number 1, in the meantime, I think I double barrel. Yeah, I think I double barrel. We do take it down. Ace 8, 7, 6, double. Table number 2. Definitely a hand I will 3-bet with, yeah. We're super deep. Like, look at this, 300 big blinds deep. But I mean, we want a 3-bet. We have a lot of things going on. Flop. Bet is reasonable. I think check is a little bit better because our flush draw is non-nutted and we're super deep. On the turn, I like a bet a lot, given that I have a lot of overpairs that can go for value at this point or protection. I don't even have to use a large sizing. And also I don't have any showdown value, right? Like that's very often a reason to bet, especially if your opponent capped his range on a prior street. I think if you don't have showdown value then, like you have suddenly a lot more incentive because you want to win the pot and you cannot win by checking. So I think betting here is definitely a reasonable play. Or I mean, for me at least, the preferred play for sure. So we bet and my opponent folds and we take it down. Nice. Let's keep going. Queen 7-6-3 rainbow and ace 8 4 deuce single. Couple of marginal hands. Ace 7 4 3 will also be a fold. Let me actually skip a little bit ahead until we go to a hand where something interesting happens. For example, 7-7-5-3. I think this is definitely a limp. So much dead money in the middle. And unfortunately, we miss. Ace 8 4 3 double on the left. I open like this looks pretty marginal. Let me open up PLO trainer. Go to our 100 big blind solution under the gun. Let's filter for ace 8 4 3 double. This hand is a pure fold. Raising it all is also pretty costly mistake, like 0.09, 0.01. So basically 0.1 equals to 10 big blind per 100. So open raising this cost me 10 big blind per 100 hands, which is definitely a significant loss. Ace high board. Good board for my range, but against 4 players, we're just gonna, I mean, against a bet, we just have a fold. Table number 2, we also will fold against a large bet. Let's see. Table number 1, this will just be a... I was thinking... I was going to say this is just going to be a defend, as in calling, but I'm pretty sure that there are hands like this or similar hands like this in this hand class where we can 3-bet bluff, which is also what I do. So I think this is reasonable. Like we also big blind against small blind. We want to find more 3-bets than in other situations. So So I think this is okay, especially if players don't 4-bet super aggressively. Usually what I think is that the 3-bet is okay. Now, ace 995. Let's briefly open PLO trainer. Let's go to 200 big blinds, because this is where we were. Ace 995, single suited. We do see that, yeah, so the value of 3-betting and calling with the 9 high suit variation is basically the same. In other words, both calling and 3-betting here is a reasonable play. Beautiful flop, middle set, easy bet. My opponent calls on the turn. We pick up additional equity. I mean, let's just keep betting. Let's just keep betting. Very unlikely my opponent has ace-ace or 10-10 at this point. He could have 10-10 sometimes, but not often. So we're just betting for value. And on the river, it is... on the river... it's a little bit tricky. It's a little bit tricky. Like, potting for value here, I think is reasonable. Especially because my opponent doesn't lead out, right? Like, I think my opponent is going to lead out with a lot of queen jack. Like, a lot of queen jack. Maybe even all of his queen jack. I mean, maybe not all, but like a lot of queen jack. Because he wants to prevent me from checking back ace 9, ace king, ace 10, like all those hands. Maybe even aces. So he's not going to have queen jack almost ever, I think. However, one thing that we should also think of, like, what are we going to get called by if we value bet that we're beating? The fact that we block the ace is not necessarily amazing, because it reduces the chance of getting called by a hand like ace king, ace 10, because we block the ace. So making value betting a little bit more problematic. At least I do see that as part of a reason to potentially not value bet. Like, I decide to check back. I think in hindsight, I don't like it. I just think I have the best hand too often. Even 3-3 is in his range. And again, like, he doesn't have a lot of queen jack, maybe none even. And he's not going to have 10-10 almost ever. He's only sometimes having king-king. He could have a hand like ace, king-king 3, ace, king-king 9. I mean, we have a 9. We have 2 9s. King-king, ace, king-king, jack, ace, king-king 10. So sometimes he has king-king. I don't know. I think this is a missed opportunity to value bet thin. And value betting thin is definitely... it's an important part of the strategy. It's almost like a skill, right? Like, you want to learn how to be able to value bet correctly on the river in big pots. And I think I missed some sort of opportunity here. And it's probably an indicator for me to dive a little bit deeper into triple barreling or value betting the river after betting flop and turn. 3-bet pots, see what is the threshold of value betting basically in big pots in these situations. I think that's something where I have some open questions. For example, with a hand like this. Anyway, table number 2. What happened on table number 2? So let's go back a bit. I think flop goes check, check. I defend the big blind turn. Pretty good hand to bet. And on the river, I river 2 pair. We have a straight blocker, blocking queen, blocking jack 10, blocking 10-6. My opponent bets half pot. It feels a little bit like we are getting sucked into a call by this sizing. Given that he checks back the flop, like a lot of ace 9, ace 3, ace ace are removed from his range. So he's saying he has backdoored into his straight. 10-6, jack 10. Or he's value betting ace 8. Ace 8. I think I have to call. I unblock clubs. I have a 10 and I have 2 pair. And the sizing is not that big. Like, I think I just have to call. I think this is a mistake, unfortunately, on my end. But hey, that happens. Guys, that's going to be it for today. Hope you did enjoy the session, reviewing my hands that I played in this PLO 100 session. If you did like the video, make sure to give the video a thumbs up below. Use the comment section if you have any questions. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And also check out PLOmastermind.com if you want to learn more about Pod Limit Omaha and get access to PLO Trainer completely for free. Click on the link below. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll catch you in the next one.